He was dragging a tiny child across the ground and bringing him before Genghis Khan. That child was no ordinary child. He was Sultan Jalaluddin's 7-year-old son, innocent, yet brave. The Mongols threw him onto the ground before Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan looked at the child's innocent face for a few moments, and then, without the slightest mercy, he raised his sword. With a single brutal strike, that tyrant cut the child into 2 pieces. On the banks of the Indus River, another innocent life was absorbed into the soil. But Sultan Jalaluddin did not yet know about this tragedy, because in the very next moment he was about to make a decision that still makes the heart of history tremble. On one side was the honor of his mother. On the other side were his loyal wives, and in front of him stood the savage army of Genghis Khan that knew nothing of mercy. Sultan Jalaluddin hardened his heart, and then he made a decision so terrifying that even today humanity shudders remembering it. On the banks of the Indus River, towering rocky cliffs stood on one side, and on the other side flowed the deep and endless river. In that narrow corner, Sultan Jalaluddin Khwarazm Shah, with only a handful of his loyal warriors, stood firm against a sea of Mongols. The location itself had become his final shield. The Mongol army could now attack only from the front. Unlike the open battlefield, here the warriors had more time to show the power of their swords. Under the red light of the setting sun, the banks of the Indus had once again become a battlefield. Just a few hours earlier, this battle had stretched for miles, but now the entire front had shrunk to a small corner on the bank of the Indus. Here, Sultan Jalaluddin Khwarazm Shah, with only a handful of his loyal warriors, stood firm against a sea of Mongols. The location itself had become his final shield. The Mongol army could now attack only from the front. Unlike the open battlefield, here the warriors had more time to show the power of their swords. Under the red light of the setting sun, the banks of the Indus had once again become a battlefield. Just a few hours earlier, this battle had stretched for miles, but now the entire front had shrunk to a small corner on the bank of the Indus. Here, Sultan Jalaluddin Khwarazm Shah, with only a handful of his loyal warriors, stood firm against a sea of Mongols, until the last breath and the last drop of blood. Blood dripped from his sword. Clots of blood had formed on his hands. His armor and clothes were covered with dark red stains. And whenever Sultan Jalaluddin shouted, "Allahu Akbar," and leapt upon the enemy like a wounded lion, the Mongol ranks would scatter for a moment. Enemy soldiers would fall back, but moments later, fresh Mongol units would surge forward again, attacking with renewed fury. Meanwhile, the Sultan's closest companions were falling one by one, drinking the cup of martyrdom, and the enemy circle was slowly growing tighter. From morning till evening, after hours of relentless fighting, the warriors' bodies were shattered with wounds and exhaustion. Their hands were growing numb. Sharp pains shot through their shoulders and wrists. Yet, despite the pain, they kept fighting, because now only one desire remained in their hearts: martyrdom.
In the midst of this blood-soaked battle, Sultan Jalaluddin had become so deeply absorbed in the fight that he no longer had any thought left for himself or even for his family. Amid the chaos of that doomsday-like battlefield, a piece of his heart, His 7-year-old innocent son, who was under the protection of the right-wing commander, Amin al-Mulk, was captured when the right flank of the army finally collapsed. The Mongol soldiers seized that innocent child and dragged him before Genghis Khan. The same Genghis Khan whom history counts among the most brutal killers of humanity. That merciless conqueror looked at the tiny figure of innocence before him, and without the slightest mercy, he raised his sword. With a single strike, that innocent child was cut into 2 pieces. And when this news reached Sultan Jalaluddin while he was still fighting on the battlefield, the arrow of a father's grief had already pierced the heart of the Sultan. But even this terrible shock could not shake his determination and resolve. Amid the horrors of the battlefield, he was so completely absorbed that he did not even have the awareness to fully feel this immense pain. Perhaps at that moment, nothing else could have turned his attention away from the battlefield, but suddenly a few heart-rending cries of women echoed through the air. These voices were coming from the direction of the Muslim camp. "Jalal! Jalal! I swear you by Allah! Kill us! Save us from the enemy's captivity!" Now there was no time left to say or hear anything more. Under normal circumstances, for Sultan Jalaluddin, it would have been far easier to jump into boiling oil, to throw himself before starving wolves, or to be buried alive in the earth, than to give death to his own mother with his own hands, or to take the life of his beloved wife. But now, without a moment's delay, he had made his decision. For him, there was no safer refuge than the turbulent waves of the Indus River. With a heart turned to stone, Sultan Jalaluddin stepped forward to carry out that decision. Only Allah knows what storm must have been raging in his heart at that moment. Then, one by one, he entrusted those sacred trusts of his life to the waters of the Indus River, and the waves of the river rose up and hid those pure bodies within their embrace. Sultan Jalaluddin did not even have time to shed 2 tears. Only a deep, manly sigh escaped his chest. And then, once again, with his sword in hand, he turned back towards the battlefield.
Now, with every strike of his sword, there was fire, and with every attack, several Mongol horsemen were cut down from their mounts and fell to the ground. On the banks of the Indus River, this bloody battle had entered its final stage. Far away, standing on a high vantage point, Genghis Khan watched everything with astonished eyes. Before him, a lone sultan stood firm against the entire Mongol army and had not yet faltered. Finally, Genghis Khan gave orders to his soldiers, "Bring him alive before me at all costs." The moment this command was heard, the Mongol soldiers' tactics changed. Now they avoided deadly attacks with arrows and spears on the sultan. They began to tighten their circle slowly. Small groups of attackers advanced forward, and every time Sultan Jalaluddin's sword struck like lightning, sending several Mongol soldiers crashing to the ground. This scene is described by Genghis Khan's court historian Atamalik Juvaini as "the Sultan fought like an enraged lion." Genghis Khan watched this astonishing display of swordsmanship with great interest. He knew that even human strength has its limits. He was confident that soon this battle would end. In his mind, after Sultan Jalaluddin's last companions fell, the Sultan would finally grow weary and exhausted, and then, like a fallen fruit, he would fall into his hands. But Sultan Jalaluddin, observing the Mongols' changing tactics, understood Genghis Khan's intent. He was fighting with the desire for martyrdom.
To him, it was unbearable that Genghis Khan might capture him alive, humiliate him, and bind him in chains of disgrace to become the target of his laughter. At that very moment, he resolved that under no circumstances would he allow Genghis Khan's plan to succeed. Meanwhile, in the thick of the battle, the Sultan reached a point where just a few steps forward would have meant falling directly into the enemy's trap. Fighting alongside him was his cousin Malik. He sensed the danger just in time. Immediately, he grabbed the reins of the Sultan's horse and pulled with all his strength, dragging him out of the enemy's grasp. But it was only a few moments of reprieve, because soon the moment would come in history that even Genghis Khan himself would watch in astonishment. Now, from every direction on the battlefield, the storm of the Mongol army was closing in on Sultan Jalaluddin. Most of his companions had already attained martyrdom. On the banks of the Indus River, he stood alone, yet still the sword remained in his hand. This was the moment when a man faces a choice: either accept a life of humiliation at the hands of the enemy, or embrace death for the sake of his freedom. Sultan Jalaluddin stood between these two paths. In front of him, the merciless army of Genghis Khan. Behind him, the wild and terrifying waves of the Indus River. But in the very next moment, a decision was about to be made. A decision that only a brave warrior or a living legend could make. A decision that even Genghis Khan himself stood silent for a few moments to witness. Invitation to the next part. Did Sultan Jalaluddin really leap into the terrifying waves of the Indus River? Did he manage to escape capture by Genghis Khan? And what was the moment that Genghis Khan himself looked at his sons and said, "Every father should be blessed with such a son"? This astonishing scene and the rest of the epic story we will see in the next part.